Welcome back to our channel, where the forgotten echoes of history are brought vividly to life. Here, we step into the private moments of queens and kings, not through textbooks, but through the details that made their world real. Tonight, we return to one of the most haunting evenings in European history, the final night of Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution's blade fell. You hear the scrape of iron hinges as a cell door closes behind you. The air is damp, thick with the smell of stone soaked by centuries of the Seine's breath. Above your head, a shaft of fading sunlight cuts across the wall. Thin, golden, fragile. It feels less like light and more like time itself, slipping away. Outside, the city stirs with the restless noise of revolution. Inside, the silence presses close, and you know this is a place where the world is about to end. In that very chamber, on the evening of October 15th in Versailles, Marie Antoinette sat alone, awaiting the verdict of her final hours. The air in Paris on October 15th, 1793, carried a brittle chill, the kind that hinted at frost, yet still held the faint scent of autumn leaves. Inside the damp gray walls of the conciergerie prison, Marie Antoinette sat on a narrow wooden bench, her back straight despite the fatigue that clung to her bones. She had been awake for hours, though it was not the cold stone floor or the thin blanket that kept her from sleeping. It was the trial, the accusations, the jeers, the cruel distortions of her life that echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. That afternoon, the verdict had been delivered, guilty of treason. The sentence, death by guillotine, to be carried out at dawn the next day. When the guards left her alone in her cell, she rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as though each step must be measured to keep her dignity intact. The cell was small, a square of damp stone, its walls stained dark where water seeped in from the Seine. A single barred window sat high above her head, far out of reach. Through it, a thin beam of late-day sunlight filtered in, pale and angled, casting a sliver of gold across the wall. Marie stepped toward that light. It was not much, but it was enough to tell her the day was fading. Soon, the sun would slip behind the rooftops of Paris for the last time she would ever see it. The Queen of France, once draped in silks and surrounded by mirrors, now stood in plain white linen, her hair cropped short after her imprisonment. There were no jewels, no perfume, no courtiers to flatter her. Yet in this small, forgotten corner of the city, she carried herself as though she still stood in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Her spine remained regal, her chin lifted. Beyond the prison walls, Paris was alive with the sounds of revolution. The calls of street vendors hawking chestnuts, the clatter of carts over cobblestones, and farther away, the faint roar of a restless crowd that never truly slept. These sounds had been her world for months now, replacing the rustle of silk gowns and the distant strains of court music. She tilted her head back toward the narrow shaft of light. Slowly, the glow shifted, deepening into amber as the sun sank lower. She could not see the sky, but she could imagine it. The horizon awash in colors she remembered from her rides in the Versailles gardens, rose pink fading into violet, gold dissolving into the cool gray of night. Some say that in her final hours, she prayed. Others believe she sat in silence, her thoughts her only company. What is certain is that she requested paper and ink, not for a final plea, but to write to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth. The letter she composed that night was brief but steadfast, filled with dignity and resolve, without bitterness. When she set the pen down, her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the chill creeping in from the stone floor. She wrapped her arms around herself and returned to the bench. The light in the cell was fading quickly now, slipping away inch by inch. She stood once more, unwilling to let it go without one last look. Somewhere in the city, the bells began to toll. Their slow, heavy rhythm seemed to match the beating of her heart. As the final edge of sunlight disappeared from the wall, she exhaled, a long, steady breath, as though letting go of the day itself. Outside, Paris prepared for the spectacle of her death. Inside, she prepared for something else entirely. The quiet acceptance that, come morning, she would walk out of this cell and into history. Night descended over Paris like a heavy velvet curtain, but within the conciergerie, the darkness was sharper, a cold, oppressive black that pressed in from every corner. The small oil lamp in Marie Antoinette's cell sputtered with a faint hiss, casting a weak, flickering light that left more shadow than illumination. She sat at the narrow table, the one where she had written her letter earlier, and folded her hands in her lap. Her fingers, pale and thin, still bore the faint indent of the quill. The letter was gone now, entrusted to the guards with the hope, faint though it was, that it would reach Madame Elisabeth. The cell was not entirely silent. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, each drop echoing through the stone corridors. Occasionally, a muffled laugh or coarse remark floated in from the guards stationed nearby. Beyond that, the city was alive with unseen movement, the rumble of carts delivering bread to the markets, the murmur of people gathered in taverns, the distant creak of a ship moored along the Seine. Life went on, indifferent to the fact that the former Queen of France awaited execution only a few hundred meters away. Marie's eyes drifted toward the door, heavy, reinforced with iron bands. A small peephole was cut into the center, and through it, she knew the guards could watch her at any moment. In the months since her imprisonment, she had learned not to flinch at their stares. She had endured worse. The trial had been a theater of humiliation, filled with lies and calculated cruelty. But the verdict had brought a strange clarity. There was nothing left to defend, no more illusions to hold. She reached for the tin cup beside her and took a sip of water. It was cold and metallic on her tongue. Hunger gnawed faintly at her. She had been offered a simple meal of bread and thin soup earlier, but she had eaten little. Her appetite had deserted her long before the sentence was read. In the quiet, she thought of her children. The image of her son, Louis Charles, came to her first, his eyes bright, his voice once quick with laughter. She remembered holding him in the gardens of Versailles, pointing out the white blossoms of the chestnut trees. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, had her father's solemnity. The last time she had seen them was months ago, when the boy was taken from her. That absence was a wound that never stopped bleeding. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. The smell of damp stone was everywhere, mingled with the faint aroma of burning oil from the lamp. Somewhere, far down the hall, a door scraped open and slammed shut, the sound carrying like a crack of thunder through the silence. A faint rustle outside her cell drew her attention. One of the guards appeared, his boots scuffing against the floor. He was a man of middle years, his face obscured in the shadows. He carried a folded blanket under one arm. Without a word, he slid it onto the bench. His eyes met hers only for an instant, not with warmth, but not with cruelty either, before he turned away and locked the door behind him. She pulled the blanket over her shoulders. It was rough against her skin, but it held the day's lingering warmth. Her thoughts drifted again, not to the court at Versailles, not to the jeweled halls, but to Austria, her childhood in Schönbrunn Palace, the scent of lilacs along the garden paths, the sound of her mother's voice. Outside the walls of the conciergerie, the Seine moved under the moonlight, carrying with it the reflections of the city's lamps. The moon itself, pale and cold, hung above Paris, the same moon she had once gazed at from her gilded bedchamber. Now, it shone over a city that had turned against her. She did not sleep easily. When her eyes closed, she saw flashes of the past. The coronation in Rheims Cathedral, the roar of the crowd, the dizzying shimmer of the ballroom chandeliers. Then, the noise of the revolution, chants, the crash of gates, the jeering faces pressed against the palace windows. Hours passed, marked only by the slow, uneven rhythm of the prison's night. Every so often, the lamp's flame guttered dangerously low, threatening to plunge the cell into complete darkness. She adjusted the blanket tighter, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the narrow window far above. She would not see the sunrise from here. Tomorrow, she would see it from the open air, on the road to the scaffold. But for now, she sat quietly in the cold glow of the dying lamp, waiting for the night to pass. The first sign of dawn was not the light, but the sound. It began as a distant stirring, boots scraping along the stone corridor, the muted clank of keys against a ring, and the low murmur of voices. Marie Antoinette had been awake for some time, her back still pressed against the cold wall, the rough prison blanket drawn around her shoulders. The air inside the cell was damp, heavy with the smell of extinguished oil from the lamp that had burned out during the night. Through the narrow slit of the high window, a thread of gray light began to creep in, barely cutting through the shadows. She tilted her head, feeling the faintest touch of cool morning air slipping in from the outside world. The hinges groaned, and the door opened. 2 guards entered, their faces set in practiced neutrality. Behind them came the clerk, a younger man in plain brown clothes, carrying a folded paper in his hand. He read from it in a steady, official voice. The sentence, the charges, and the time of execution. That morning, at around 11. Marie stood as they spoke, her movements measured, her chin lifted. When they were finished, she inclined her head in acknowledgement. Not a word of protest left her lips. She was given a basin of cold water to wash. The water stung her fingers, numbing them as she splashed it onto her face. There was no mirror. She had not seen her own reflection in months. But she knew her hair was cropped short, her cheeks hollowed from imprisonment. Once, she would have dressed with the help of 3 ladies-in-waiting, each arranging the silks and ribbons that marked her rank. Now, she dressed herself in a plain white shift and the coarse, dark skirt the guards provided. A priest was brought in, the Abbé Edgeworth de Firmont, the man who would accompany her to the scaffold. His presence was a small mercy, a reminder of faith amid the machinery of death. He bowed his head to her, and she returned the gesture with quiet dignity. They exchanged only a few words at first, each aware of the gravity of the hours ahead. The clerk placed a document before her, the record of her trial, the official account that history would keep. She signed it with a steady hand, though her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she set down the quill. The guards stepped back, giving her a small allowance of privacy to speak with the abbé. Their conversation was low, their voices almost swallowed by the thick stone walls. He asked if she feared death. She replied, as was later recorded, that she sought only the strength to face it with courage, to meet her fate as a queen should. The first full light of morning now spilled into the cell. It was not the warm, golden light of spring or summer, but the pale, cold gleam of an October day. Dust motes drifted in it, turning slowly as though time itself had slowed. From beyond the prison walls, she could hear the city awakening, the creak of cartwheels, the clip of hooves, the distant bark of a dog. Life in Paris continued, unaware or indifferent to the quiet preparation of the morning's execution. Somewhere across the river, bread was baking, and she caught the faintest scent of it on the air, sharp, yeasty, almost mocking in its reminder of ordinary life. The abbé offered her the sacrament, which she accepted with bowed head. She murmured a prayer under her breath, one she had known since childhood, its words a thread that connected her back to the corridors of Schönbrunn, to the chapel where her mother had once knelt. When the moment came, the guards re-entered, this time with a stronger purpose in their step. One carried a length of coarse rope, not for her wrists, but for the cart in which she would be taken. Unlike her husband, King Louis XVI, she would not be afforded a closed carriage. She would ride to the scaffold in an open cart, fully exposed to the eyes and the voices of the crowd. She knew what awaited her. The shouts, the insults, perhaps worse. But she also knew that her composure in those moments would be her last act of defiance. The morning light in the cell grew brighter, almost blinding now in contrast to the darkness of the night before. Marie Antoinette took one last look at the walls around her. The cracks in the stone, the faint scratches left by other prisoners, the place on the bench where she had sat to watch her final sunset. This room had been the narrow stage for her last hours of life. Soon, the world outside would be her final theater. The door to her cell opened wider this time, and the damp, stale air of the conciergerie mixed with a new smell, the sharper scent of the Seine drifting in from outside. The guards motioned for her to follow. Marie Antoinette stood, smoothing her skirt with both hands, not out of vanity, but as an instinctive gesture. The same way she had once composed herself before stepping into the public eye at Versailles. 2 soldiers took position on either side of her. The abbé walked just behind, his head slightly bowed, his hands clasped in front of him. The corridor outside was narrow, its walls lined with thick shadows that seemed to cling to the prisoners' cells. They passed 1 or 2 other figures, pale faces peering out from behind the iron bars, eyes following her in silence. Her footsteps were soft against the worn stone floor, but the soldiers' boots struck in a steady rhythm. Every sound echoed. The scrape of metal as another cell door was bolted shut, the faint clatter of keys swinging at a guard's hip. Somewhere deeper in the prison, a cough rang out, rough and hollow, quickly swallowed by the silence. At the far end of the corridor, the heavy outer door came into view. A square of daylight spilled through the opening, cutting across the floor in a band of pale gold. As she stepped toward it, the chill in the air deepened, carrying with it the earthy scent of wet cobblestones and the metallic tang of the river. The moment she emerged into the courtyard, the light struck her fully, thin, cold, and unflinching. The October sky above Paris was washed in a dull silver, the kind of color that softened nothing. Across the courtyard stood the open cart that would carry her to the Place de la Révolution. 2 large wheels supported the flat wooden bed, its surface bare except for a low bench where she was to sit. The harnessed horse stamped its hooves against the stones, its breath a pale mist in the morning air. Unlike the closed carriage that had carried Louis XVI to his execution, this open cart left no protection from the eyes and the voices of the people. That was the intention. Her journey would be a spectacle from start to finish. The guards gestured for her to climb aboard. Marie placed one hand on the side of the cart and stepped up without hesitation, her movements deliberate, her balance sure despite the uneven planks beneath her feet. She seated herself on the bench, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The abbé climbed in beside her, his presence a quiet anchor amid the growing noise beyond the prison walls. Around them, soldiers formed a square formation, their muskets held at the ready. The captain barked an order, and the gate ahead creaked open on its iron hinges. The sound hit her first, a sudden swelling roar that poured into the courtyard. Beyond the walls, the streets of Paris were already packed. Hundreds of faces turned toward the gate, their expressions a mix of curiosity, contempt, and something darker. Shouts rang out, some calling for vengeance, others jeering her name. The cart lurched forward, the horse pulling them through the archway and out into the street. The wheels rattled over the cobblestones, jarring her slightly with each turn, but she did not shift in her seat. The smell of the city rushed at her, a mingling of horse manure, wood smoke, roasting chestnuts, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies pressed together. Above the crowd, the rooftops of Paris loomed close, their chimneys puffing thin streams of smoke into the cold morning air. She kept her eyes forward, not scanning the faces, not reacting to the insults. There was a quiet power in her stillness, a refusal to give the crowd what they wanted. The abbé leaned toward her and spoke softly, words meant for her ears alone. "Madame, "Fix your thoughts on God," he murmured. "I am," she replied, her voice low but firm. As they turned onto a wider boulevard, the sunlight broke briefly through the clouds, washing the facades of the buildings in a pale gold. For a moment, the scene could almost have been any morning in Paris. Market stalls being set up, a dog weaving between carts, the call of a bread seller ringing down the street. But the soldiers' formation, the shouting mob, and the wooden cart at its center told a different story. Ahead, in the far distance, she could see it, faint but unmistakable. Rising above the heads of the crowd was the tall, triangular frame of the guillotine, its blade catching a brief flash of light. Her journey to it had begun. The cart creaked forward at a slow, deliberate pace, as though the moment itself resisted arriving too soon. Soldiers lined both sides of the street, pushing back the crowd that surged toward the wooden wheels. The air was thick with breath and voices, the noise shifting from angry shouts to mocking laughter, then to the rhythmic chanting of her name, drawn out in a tone that was both jeer and accusation. Marie Antoinette kept her gaze steady, fixed just beyond the mass of faces. She had learned long ago that stillness could be a shield. To look away would be to appear timid. To engage would be to give them the satisfaction they sought. Instead, she let her posture speak for her. Upright, composed, her chin neither lowered in shame nor lifted in defiance, but held at the quiet angle of someone who refuses to be broken. The abbé sat beside her, murmuring prayers under his breath. Every so often, he would lean closer to repeat a phrase, and she would answer softly, the words nearly drowned by the roar of the street. They did not speak of her trial, her crimes, or the life she had once lived. There was no need. All of it hung unspoken in the air between them. The smell of the city grew heavier as the cart moved on. Paris in October was a mix of scents: roasting chestnuts from small braziers, damp wool from coats and shawls, the pungent tang of fish from the market, and the smoke of fires burning in narrow hearths. But beneath it all was the unmistakable human smell of the crowd itself, a heat that rose from hundreds of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. She caught glimpses of shop fronts as they passed, a bakery with loaves stacked high in its window, a hatmaker's stall with ribbons fluttering in the breeze, a cooper's workshop where barrels lay in neat rows. These were the everyday scenes of Paris, the life of the city she had once ruled from gilded halls. Now she saw it from the level of the street, in the open air, surrounded not by courtiers, but by the people who had cast her down. They crossed a small bridge, the Seine sliding slow and dark beneath them. The smell of the river rose up, cool and metallic, tinged with the faint rot of fallen leaves caught in the current. On the far bank, the crowd was even thicker, the streets narrowed by tall buildings that seemed to funnel the noise upward until it pressed against the sky. At one point, the cart jolted over a loose cobblestone, throwing her slightly forward. Her hand caught the rough edge of the bench, and she steadied herself without a word. A sharp voice from the crowd shouted something obscene. A handful of others laughed. Marie did not turn her head. The abbé, watching her closely, later said he saw no flicker of anger in her face, only a stillness that seemed to grow deeper with each passing street. She did not retreat into herself, but rather seemed to open her senses to every moment. The weight of the cold air on her skin, the shifting light as clouds passed over the sun, the rhythm of the horse's hooves against the stones. Somewhere ahead, the sharp metallic clang of hammer against iron rang out, the final adjustments being made to the guillotine. The crowd's noise swelled as word spread that she was drawing closer. They turned onto the final stretch of the Rue Saint-Honoré. Here, the buildings loomed higher, their upper windows thrown open, heads and shoulders leaning out to catch a glimpse of her. Some called down curses, others simply watched in silence, their faces unreadable. The open square of the Place de la Révolution began to open before them, and there it stood in full. the guillotine, stark against the pale sky. Its wooden frame rose above the crowd like a dark monument, the heavy blade gleaming faintly in the light. Around its base, the executioners moved with brisk efficiency, arranging the scaffold and ensuring the mechanism was ready. The horse slowed, and the cart rolled to a stop at the edge of the square. The sound of the crowd swelled and broke like waves against the shore. Soldiers stepped forward to clear a path through the press of bodies, their bayonets catching the light. The abbé leaned toward her, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. "We have arrived, madame." She gave the faintest nod. The moment she had walked toward since the verdict, since that last sunset in her cell, had come. The soldiers flanked the cart as Marie Antoinette stood. The planks beneath her feet were rough and splintered, but she stepped down without faltering. Her hands were free. The law had not bound her wrists, yet she kept them together in front of her, fingers lightly interlaced. The Abbé Edgeworth descended after her, placing himself just at her shoulder. The two exchanged a brief glance. In that look, he offered silent reassurance. In hers, he gave him a quiet resolve that needed no words. The path to the scaffold was short but deliberate. The crowd pressed forward from all sides, their cries a chaotic mixture, some shrill with anger, others hoarse from shouting, and a few silent, their eyes fixed on her as if trying to memorize the sight. Soldiers held the line, muskets at the ready, the steel of their bayonets glinting in the pale morning light. Marie walked with measured steps, her chin level, her gaze fixed on the wooden platform ahead. The guillotine rose above her now, its frame a dark silhouette against the pale sky. The blade was drawn high, gleaming faintly where a stray shaft of sunlight touched it. From this distance, the device seemed unnervingly still, yet it carried a presence. The kind of presence that made the air itself feel heavier. The boards of the scaffold creaked as she mounted the steps. The executioner, Sanson, stood waiting, a large man with a leather apron and steady hands. His assistants moved quietly behind him, arranging ropes, checking the grooves where the blade would fall. There was no ceremony to their movements, only the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to this work. When she reached the top, she turned slightly toward the abbé. He leaned close, and their conversation was quiet enough that only fragments carried to those nearby. He reminded her that in a few moments she would stand before God, and that her courage here would be her final offering. She listened intently, her eyes steady, then inclined her head in acknowledgement. The executioner stepped forward, gesturing toward the wooden plank where she would be secured. For a moment, she did not move, not in resistance, but in pause. Then, gathering her skirt in one hand to keep it from catching, she crossed to the plank. As she did, a soldier stepped back suddenly, his foot brushing against hers. The cart that had brought her stood close by, and one of its wheels protruded into her path. She shifted to avoid it, and in doing so, her foot came down directly on the soldier's boot. "Pardon me, monsieur," she said clearly. The words were not whispered. They were spoken with the same composure as if she had been in a salon at Versailles. It was the last sentence she would ever speak aloud. The soldier froze, caught off guard by the unexpected courtesy. Even in this moment, with the scaffold beneath her feet and the blade above, she had remembered her manners. Sanson approached, and with a nod from her, began his work. He tied her hands lightly, more from formality than necessity. Her head was positioned against the lunette, the wooden frame that would hold it in place. The wood smelled faintly of oil and something metallic, the lingering trace of the work it had been built to do. The abbé stood at her side until the final moment, murmuring prayers in Latin. Her lips moved with his, the quiet syllables carrying into the cold air. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again to the pale sky. Above her, the clouds shifted, and a brief flash of sunlight broke through, casting the faintest warmth over the platform. She saw it. And in that instant, perhaps, the memory of the previous day's sunset returned to her, the gold fading into violet on the prison wall, the last soft light she would ever call her own. The executioner gave a signal. A deep, mechanical clunk echoed as the blade's weight shifted. The world held its breath. The moment stretched thin, like the held breath before a storm. The guillotine's blade hung above, poised in its groove, the polished steel catching the weak October light. Around the scaffold, the noise of the crowd softened into a low, expectant murmur. Even the jeers seemed to falter, drawn into the gravity of the scene. Marie Antoinette stood as still as the wooden frame around her, her head tilted slightly forward, eyes fixed not on the crowd below, but on something far beyond them, a point in the sky no one else could see. Her lips moved once more with the abbé's prayer, the Latin syllables falling in a rhythm older than the revolution itself. Sanson's assistants tightened the final restraints with practiced efficiency. The ropes scraped faintly against the coarse fabric of her shift, pulling snug around her arms. The wood of the lunette pressed cool against the side of her neck. The executioner's hands were steady. He had done this countless times before, yet there was an unmistakable air of caution in his movements now. Not hesitation, but a precise care, as though aware that history was watching. From the crowd below came the sound of a cough, the shuffle of feet on cobblestone, the creak of a cartwheel turning in the distance. Somewhere, a woman called out a name, not the Queen's, but a friend's in the throng, and the sound seemed oddly sharp in the quiet. The abbé leaned close, his voice low but firm. "Daughter of St. Louis, ascend to heaven." Her gaze flickered toward him. For the briefest moment, the lines of fatigue seemed to lift from her face, and there was a clarity in her eyes, the look of someone who has accepted the end fully and without fear. Sanson stepped back, giving the smallest of nods to his assistant. The great lever was pulled. The mechanism released with a swift, metallic hiss. The blade plunged, cutting through the air in a clean arc, faster than the eye could truly follow. A sharp report rang out as steel met wood, echoing through the square. A single, unified roar erupted from the crowd. Some shouted in triumph, others in shock, and some in silence, simply watching. Hats were thrown into the air, fists were raised, a few turned away, unable to look any longer. The executioners moved with brisk precision, their faces expressionless. Sanson stepped forward to lift the severed head by the hair, presenting it to the assembled mass. A wave of sound broke again. Cheers, insults, the deep thrum of hundreds of voices overlapping in chaotic harmony. From his place on the scaffold, the abbé closed his eyes for a moment, lips moving in a final prayer. He did not look at the crowd, nor at what they now celebrated. Below, the blood darkened the wood of the platform, following grooves worn into it by countless other executions. It dripped steadily into the sawdust spread beneath, the scent of iron heavy in the morning air. The soldiers began to move, forming ranks once more. The body, now headless, was covered with a rough cloth and removed from the scaffold. The head was placed into a basket lined with straw. Both would soon be taken away for burial in an unmarked grave, the location known only to a handful of officials. In the square, the noise began to recede as the crowd's attention turned elsewhere, to the next rumor, the next spectacle, the next turn of the revolution's wheel. Already, vendors were calling out again, selling bread and wine to those who had gathered to watch. The sun rose higher over Paris, casting light on the stone facades, the river beyond, and the scaffold that now stood empty. For the city, this was the end of a queen. For history, it was the closing of an era. And for Marie Antoinette, it was the moment she had walked toward since that last golden light faded in her cell. The Abbé Edgeworth descended the scaffold slowly, each step heavy with the weight of what had just passed. Around him, the square was already shifting. the feverish roar of the crowd breaking into smaller currents of chatter, argument, and laughter. The air still carried the sharp scent of iron from the execution, mingled with the dust kicked up by so many feet. Sanson and his assistants worked in practiced silence. The queen's body, shrouded in coarse linen, was lifted from the platform and placed into a simple wooden cart. The head, resting in its straw-lined basket, was set beside it. There was no ceremony, no words, only the steady rhythm of work. In the France of 1793, death had become an industry, and this was its most public machinery. The abbé walked close to the cart, keeping his eyes low. He had promised to accompany her to the very end, and though his duties as confessor were complete, there was a sense that he was still guarding her, even now. As the cart rolled away from the Place de la Révolution, soldiers fell into formation to escort it. They moved through streets that were quieter now, though not silent. Here and there, knots of people lingered, speaking in hushed tones, or still trading insults about the queen. Some followed at a distance, their curiosity not yet satisfied. Others turned away, heading toward the markets or back to their homes, the morning spectacle already fading into memory. The route to the burial ground was narrow and winding, the cart's wooden wheels grinding over uneven cobblestones. The October air was cool, and in its stillness, the faint cries of vendors could be heard in the distance. The calls for bread, for fresh fish, for roasted chestnuts. Life continued, indifferent to what had just ended. The destination was the Madeleine Cemetery, a small, unassuming plot of ground bordered by high walls. It had become the resting place for those executed at the guillotine, the king earlier that year, and now the queen. Here, the earth was churned and dark from the constant digging of graves. There were no marble monuments, no carved angels, no flowers. Only the plain wooden markers that gave no names, just the order of burial. The gravediggers, already at work when the cart arrived, moved with mechanical efficiency. A fresh pit had been dug, long and narrow. The linen-wrapped body was lowered into it first. The head followed, placed carefully beside it. There were no prayers said aloud, no rites. The abbé whispered a final blessing, his voice barely audible over the scrape of shovels as the earth began to fall. The sound was dull and final, soil striking linen, striking flesh, striking wood. Bit by bit, the queen vanished from sight. The smell of the freshly turned earth mingled with the faint tang of decay that lingered over the cemetery. When the grave was filled, it was leveled quickly, marked only by a wooden stake. No inscription was carved. To those who might pass by, it was just another grave among many. The abbé stood for a moment longer, his lips moving in silent prayer. He knew that this anonymity was deliberate, that the revolution had stripped her of title, of crown, of life, and now of even the dignity of a name upon her grave. Yet he also knew that memory was not buried so easily. Somewhere beyond these walls, there were still those who remembered her laughter in the gardens of Versailles, her hand on her children's shoulders, the bright fabrics she had once worn on summer days. By the time he left the cemetery, the morning light had strengthened, breaking fully through the clouds. The streets of Paris seemed almost ordinary again, shop shutters opening, bakers pulling trays of bread from their ovens, washerwomen calling to each other over the splashing of basins. But in the heart of the city, the Place de la Révolution still held the scaffold, its planks darkened with fresh stains. The crowd had dispersed, yet the echo of its cries seemed to hang in the air, as if the square itself remembered. And far from there, in a small plot of earth behind high walls, lay Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution, her final sunset, now part of history. For days after her death, Paris seemed to hold a strange tension in its air, not silence, but a lingering heaviness, as though the city itself was aware that something irreversible had happened. The Place de la Révolution still bore the scaffold, and each morning it was cleaned and prepared for the next execution. Yet the memory of the Queen's final walk still clung to the square. Those who had been there recounted it endlessly, each story colored by the teller's own convictions. In the markets, the versions varied. Some swore she had walked with arrogance, refusing to bow her head. Others claimed they had seen her pale and trembling, on the verge of collapse. A few, fewer than they dared admit aloud, spoke quietly of her composure, of how she had not flinched, even when the crowd jeered. These accounts spread not just in Paris, but into the countryside, carried by travelers, merchants, and soldiers returning home. In the salons of those who still harbored monarchist sympathies, the conversation was hushed but intense. Letters were written and smuggled across borders to the émigré communities, in Vienna, in Koblenz, in London, describing her final moments in detail. To them, her death was not just the execution of a deposed queen. It was a martyrdom, the final chapter in the tragedy that had begun with the fall of Versailles. But for the revolutionaries who had fought to see her brought to the scaffold, her death was both an ending and a warning. Pamphlets circulated in the days following, painting her as the embodiment of tyranny, proof that even the highest in the land could be brought low. The execution was not to be seen as the end of the revolution's work, but as a step towards something even greater. A new France, free from kings and queens altogether. The Abbé Edgeworth remained in Paris for only a short time after. His position had been precarious even before the execution. Now, with his role in attending her final hours known to many, he chose to leave quietly. In his later writings, he would recall her composure, her last words, and above all, the manner in which she met her death, with a dignity that, he believed, could not be stripped from her. At the Madeleine Cemetery, the grave lay unmarked, just as intended. The workers there quickly moved on to their next duties. The burial ground received bodies almost daily. Yet some whispered that at night, figures could be seen near the wall, shadows slipping in to kneel at the spot where she was buried, leaving small tokens: a white flower, a scrap of ribbon, a folded note, weighted with a stone. The autumn days grew shorter, and the chill deepened in the air. Paris returned to its routines, the constant machinery of the revolution grinding on. Trials continued, sentences were passed, and the guillotine's blade rose and fell again and again. But for those who had seen her, whether they cursed her name or mourned her, the image of that morning remained fixed in memory. The open cart rattling over the cobblestones, the white linen dress stark against the dark wood of the scaffold, the brief flash of sunlight before the blade fell. It was, for many, the last time they would see a Queen of France alive. And though the revolution sought to erase the symbols of the old order, history has a way of preserving such moments, holding them like pressed flowers in the pages of time. Fragile, faded, yet still carrying the shape and color of what once was. Her final sunset, unseen by most, had been a quiet thing, a strip of light across the wall of a prison cell. But for those who remembered her, that light would take on a different meaning. It was not just the end of a day, it was the closing of an age. Beyond France's borders, the news of Marie Antoinette's execution traveled quickly, carried by couriers and foreign diplomats. In Vienna, her birthplace, the court received the message with a mixture of outrage and grief. Her brother, Emperor Francis II, read the official account in silence before ordering a private mass to be held for her soul. The Habsburg court wore black for a period of mourning, though the gesture carried no power to change what had happened in Paris. Across Europe, reactions were shaped by politics as much as sentiment. In London, the newspapers printed vivid, and often embellished, descriptions of her final hours, framing them as proof of the revolution's brutality. Political cartoonists, however, split in tone. Some depicted her as a tragic, martyred figure. Others portrayed her with the same satirical cruelty that had followed her throughout her reign. In the émigré circles of Koblenz and Turin, her death was spoken of in hushed, bitter tones. These were the nobles who had fled France in the early days of the Revolution, many of them friends or acquaintances of the Queen. They imagined her as they had last seen her, dressed in shimmering silk, greeting guests in the mirrored halls of Versailles, and struggled to reconcile that image with the reality of her end. For them, her death was not merely personal. It symbolized the destruction of everything they had once known. Yet, in revolutionary Paris, life pressed on relentlessly. The convention moved to other matters, the committees debated new decrees, and the guillotine continued its work. The citizens who had thronged the Place de la Révolution on October 16th now spoke of other trials, other names, other spectacles to come. Still, there were moments when her absence was felt. Some of the women who had been imprisoned with her at the conciergerie and later released would speak years later of the quiet dignity she maintained during her confinement. They recalled how she folded her few possessions neatly, how she thanked the guards who brought her water, and how she avoided speaking ill of others, even those who had condemned her. For those who had guarded her, the memory was more complicated. A few admitted to feeling a reluctant respect for her composure, even as they despised her as a symbol of the monarchy. One soldier, many years later, would write in his memoirs that the thing he remembered most about that morning was not the roar of the crowd, nor the sight of the guillotine, but the moment she stepped accidentally on his foot and apologized. It was, he wrote, the last courtesy of a queen. Meanwhile, the Madeleine Cemetery, where she had been buried, remained a place of grim anonymity. Bodies were laid there almost daily, each one covered quickly in soil and marked only with wooden stakes. The earth was churned constantly, the graves so close together that the ground seemed a patchwork of fresh and fading mounds. No monument marked her place, no flowers were officially allowed. Yet rumors persisted that in the still hours before dawn, a few dared to come, leaving white roses pressed into the soil, or tying scraps of pale ribbon to the rough wooden marker. Winter was approaching. The days grew short, the light pale and fleeting. Paris, wrapped in smoke from its countless hearths, felt smaller under the gray sky. And yet, in the minds of those who remembered, there was still that image of her final sunset, a narrow beam of gold spilling into a damp stone cell, touching her face for the last time. It was a memory that could not be erased by decrees, nor buried beneath unmarked earth. In time, it would become part of the tapestry of her legend, a quiet, human moment that stood apart from the grandeur of her past and the violence of her end. The revolution did not pause to remember. By the time a week had passed since the Queen's execution, the conciergerie had filled again with prisoners awaiting trial, their fates as uncertain as hers had once been. The cell she had occupied was cleared quickly and given to another, its damp walls and narrow bench bearing no trace of its most famous occupant. Yet those who had seen her in her final hours carried the memory quietly. One of the guards, a man who had been posted at the far end of the corridor the night before her death, later described watching her stand beneath the beam of fading sunlight in her cell. He did not hear her speak, but he saw her lift her face toward the light, still and unblinking, as though memorizing it. He would never forget it, though he spoke of it rarely, knowing such words could be dangerous in a city where sympathy for the executed could be seen as treason. Far from Paris, in the Austrian court, the image of that last moment was shaped not by eyewitnesses, but by letters and rumor. Her family clung to accounts that emphasized her courage, how she had walked to the scaffold without faltering, how she had spoken with calm dignity until the end. In Vienna, portraits of her in youth were draped with black cloth, and the Empress's gardens were said to be unusually quiet in those days, as though mourning alongside the court. In the years to come, the Madeleine Cemetery would continue to receive the victims of the Revolution's justice. The wooden markers that once stood over the graves decayed or were removed, their positions known only to the gravediggers. And yet, whispers persisted that some could still identify the Queen's resting place, a small patch of ground near the northern wall, where the soil seemed fresher than elsewhere. In late 1795, 2 years after her death, a new France was beginning to take shape. The worst of the terror had passed, and a cautious sense of stability was returning. It was then that quiet petitions began to reach the government from those who wished to see the remains of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette moved to a proper burial place. The petitions were ignored at first. The revolution's wounds were still too fresh, the political risks too high. But the memory of her last moments endured, retold in different forms. In monarchist circles, she became a symbol of endurance in the face of humiliation. For Republicans, she remained a warning against the excesses and indifference of the Ancien Regime. And for ordinary Parisians who had no love for monarchy, yet no taste for cruelty, she became something more complicated, a figure both condemned and pitied. Stories filtered into print, into jeers. Some were embellished beyond recognition, others clung to factual detail. The most enduring were those that preserved the human moments. The quiet act of writing to Madame Elisabeth in her cell, the faint smile she gave the abbé, the way she steadied herself in the jolting cart, and, most famously, her last words, the apology to the soldier whose foot she had stepped on. The scaffold on the Place de la Révolution would claim many more lives after hers, but to many, the morning of October 16, 1793, remained singular. It was the day France watched the last queen meet her fate, and the day when the revolution's promise of equality before the law was displayed in its most final, unflinching form. Yet for all the political meaning ascribed to it, for all the symbolism layered onto her story, there was also the simple truth of her humanity. In the end, her last sunset had not been witnessed by crowds or recorded in paintings. It had been a small, private thing, a fading band of light in a damp cell, seen by a woman who knew that when it disappeared, she would never see another. Years passed, and the France that had executed its king and queen continued to transform. The guillotine was eventually removed from the Place de la Révolution, and the square itself was renamed, as if changing the name could soften the memories that clung to it. The Madeleine Cemetery, where Marie Antoinette had been buried in anonymity, became overgrown in places, its soil churned by constant use, and its boundaries gradually encroached upon by the growing city. But memory is stubborn. Even without a monument, even without an inscription, the story of the Queen's last hours remained vivid in certain circles. Former courtiers and émigrés kept her image alive in whispered conversations in Vienna, London, and Turin. In their recollections, Versailles glimmered again. The mirrored halls, the music of court dances, the scent of roses in the gardens. The grim reality of the Revolution's prisons was softened in these retellings, replaced with visions of her enduring grace, her composure in the face of death. Among monarchists, these stories were not merely nostalgia. They were a kind of resistance, a way to preserve the symbols and values the revolution had tried to erase. In pamphlets and private letters, they painted her final moments as saint-like, framing her as a victim of injustice rather than a casualty of political upheaval. The quiet detail of her last sunset, that lone sliver of golden light on the wall of her cell, became an emblem in itself, a metaphor for a life that had once shone brightly and was now extinguished. For the revolutionaries who had supported her execution, time blurred her image in a different way. To some, she remained the embodiment of royal excess, the figure they had rallied against during the days of bread riots and political pamphlets. Yet even among the most hardened, there were those who privately admitted that her death had carried a certain weight, that there was something unsettling in the dignity with which she had mounted the scaffold. The Abbé Edgeworth, who had stood beside her in her final moments, left France soon after. His account, written years later, was measured and restrained, yet suffused with admiration for her composure. He recorded her prayers, her final words, and the quiet acceptance in her demeanor. Nowhere in his writing did he speak of fear in her eyes. Instead, he described a stillness, as if she had already stepped beyond the reach of the jeering crowd. In Paris, the Madeleine Cemetery continued to swallow the remains of the revolution's victims. As the political climate shifted, some began to speak more openly about giving the royal couple a proper burial. It was a dangerous conversation in the 1790s, but by the time the Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1814, the idea became a reality. In January 1815, more than 21 years after her execution, Marie Antoinette's remains were exhumed, along with those of Louis XVI. The discovery was grim but decisive. The bodies were identified by their burial records and the location within the cemetery. They were placed in lead coffins and carried in solemn procession to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French royalty. The reburial was a ceremony steeped in both reverence and political theater. Incense hung heavy in the air, and the echo of chants filled the vaulted ceiling of the basilica. For those present, it was not just the return of a queen to her rightful place, but the closing of a violent chapter in France's history. And yet, for all the grandeur of that moment, the most poignant image remained the simplest one: the memory of her in that prison cell, watching the last light of day fade from the wall. It was an image that no monument, no tomb, no royal procession could eclipse. When the coffins of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were lowered into their final resting place at Saint-Denis, the great basilica was hushed except for the slow toll of its bells. Light filtered down through the high stained glass windows, pooling in soft colors across the stone floor. Courtiers in black stood shoulder to shoulder with old émigrés who had returned from exile, their faces lined with the passing of decades. For those who had known the Queen in life, the ceremony stirred memories that were both gilded and tragic. They recalled her youthful arrival from Austria, her laughter in the gardens of Versailles, her lavish entertainments, and later, the tense, uncertain days of the Revolution, when every decision felt like walking across thin ice. Some wept quietly, not only for her, but for an entire world that had vanished with her death. The restored Bourbon monarchy wanted this burial to be an act of closure, a reclaiming of royal dignity. Priests chanted prayers over the coffins, and the royal arms were displayed prominently, as though to declare that despite the revolution, the line of kings and queens endured. But for all its grandeur, the moment carried a shadow, an awareness that the decades between her death and this reburial had been marked by profound change. The France she had once ruled no longer existed, except in memory. The Abbé Edgeworth had not lived to see this day. He had died in exile, far from the country where he had once whispered prayers into the Queen's ear moments before the blade fell. His written account, however, was known to some in attendance, and it colored the way they imagined her final hours. Through his words, they could almost see her again, not as the girl who had come from Vienna to marry a French dauphin, nor as the queen presiding over Versailles, but as the prisoner in white linen, standing in the shaft of fading sunlight on her last evening. Outside the basilica, the people of Saint-Denis gathered to watch the procession. Many were too young to remember the revolution firsthand, but they had grown up hearing the stories. Some saw the reburial as a rightful act of honor. Others, more skeptical, saw it as political theater meant to strengthen the restored monarchy's claim. Yet all were drawn to witness it, if only because it marked the end of one of history's most dramatic chapters. In the years that followed, artists and writers would revisit her story again and again. Some painted her as a tragic heroine, others as a flawed figure caught in the sweep of history. In romantic literature, her final moments were often softened, wrapped in sentiment, with her last sunset described in colors more vivid than the gray light that had actually filled her cell. Playwrights reimagined her as noble and selfless. Critics revived the image of her as frivolous and detached from reality. She became, in death, what she had been in life, a mirror onto which France projected its own desires, fears, and divisions. And yet, amid all the interpretations and retellings, that single image endured: the beam of golden light, the prison's damp walls, and the quiet woman who stood alone, knowing it was the last sunset she would ever see. The tomb at Saint-Denis became a place of pilgrimage for monarchists. White flowers appeared there each year on the anniversary of her death, their petals a faint echo of the light that had once touched her face. Visitors would kneel before her effigy, their fingers brushing the carved folds of stone as if they could somehow reach through time to that final moment in the conciergerie. Even now, more than 2 centuries later, that image still glimmers in the historical memory, not because it was dramatic, but because it was not. The last sunset of Marie Antoinette was not a public spectacle. It was private, quiet, and utterly human. And perhaps that is why it has never faded. Long after the Bourbon Restoration, the image of Marie Antoinette's final hours continued to travel through France and beyond, carried in the pages of memoirs, whispered in salons, and retold in drawing rooms where the echoes of the Ancien Régime still lingered. Yet with each retelling, the details shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes drastically, shaped by the storyteller's loyalty or prejudice. In the monarchist imagination, she was transformed into a near saint, serene in her suffering, forgiving toward her enemies, dignified even in the face of the guillotine's blade. For Republicans, her composure was often reinterpreted as stubborn pride, the last trace of a queen unwilling to admit fault. And for those without strong political ties, she became something more ambiguous, neither pure martyr nor villain, but a woman caught in a storm far greater than herself. Historians in the 19th century sought to strip away the myth and recover the documented truth. They pored over court records, trial transcripts, and prison logs, matching the Abbé Edgeworth's account with the recollections of guards, clerks, and witnesses in the crowd. Some details emerged clearly: the white linen dress, the open cart, the apology to the soldier whose foot she stepped on. Others remained hazy, such as what she thought during the night before her execution, or how long she stood in the light of that final sunset. The story of that sunset began to take on a symbolic life of its own. In portraits and engravings produced decades later, artists depicted it with deliberate romance. The stone walls softened by a warm glow, her face calm and illuminated as though by divine light. The reality was surely harsher: the cell cold, the air damp, the sunlight weak in the October haze. Yet the idea of it as a moment of grace proved irresistible. By the late 1800s, the conciergerie itself had become a site of historical pilgrimage. Visitors from across Europe came to walk its corridors, stopping at the cell identified as hers. Guides would point out the narrow window where the light fell, the worn bench where she sat, and the table where she had written her final letter. Tourists leaned close to the walls, as though they might still feel the imprint of that last evening. It was in this period that poets and novelists wove her story into works of romantic tragedy. They lingered on the contrast between her gilded youth and her stark end, between the laughter of Versailles and the silence of the prison. The last sunset became a literary motif, the golden thread in a tapestry of loss, standing for both the close of her life and the close of an entire world order. In truth, that small rectangle of fading light probably meant more to her in those hours than to anyone who would later write about it. She had no audience then, no painter to capture the way it touched the wall, no chronicler to record whether she reached for it with her eyes or simply let it fade. And yet, precisely because it was unobserved, it carried a kind of purity, a private reckoning between herself and the passage of time. When she stepped into the cart the next morning, she left that light behind forever. But in the centuries that followed, it would follow her instead. In art, in memory, in the quiet imaginings of those who tried to understand what it means to face the end with dignity. Even today, historians still argue over Marie Antoinette's place in history, whether she was a victim of circumstance, a symbol of monarchy's decadence, or something in between. But on one point, even her harshest critics often agree. In the last hours of her life, she met death without collapse or visible fear. And somewhere, in the small cell where she spent her final night, the light of her last sunset still lingers in the collective memory, a fragile glow that history has refused to let fade. 2 centuries have passed since Marie Antoinette stood in the conciergerie, watching the light fade from her cell wall. The world has changed beyond recognition. Monarchies have fallen, republics have risen, and the Paris she once knew is now a city of broad boulevards and glowing street lamps. And yet, her story has never vanished. The places tied to her final days still stand, each carrying their own echo. The Place de la Révolution is now the Place de la Concorde, its fountains and obelisk masking the fact that it was once a stage for the revolution's most decisive acts. The conciergerie, no longer a prison, welcomes visitors who step into its chill corridors, imagining what it must have been to walk there in her footsteps. At the Madeleine Cemetery, nothing remains of the burial ground. The space has been repurposed, the earth reshaped, but the Basilica of Saint-Denis now holds her tomb, its marble effigy lying in repose beside that of Louis XVI. In art and film, her last sunset continues to be reimagined, sometimes as a grand, glowing moment of epiphany, other times as a quiet, somber farewell. Writers describe it in shades of gold and violet, in the stillness of air before night falls, in the unblinking acceptance of what is to come. Even when the scene is fictionalized, its emotional truth remains powerful. The image of a woman, once surrounded by opulence, stripped of all but her presence of mind, facing the inevitable with dignity. The fascination endures because that moment is more than a historical detail. It is a universal human reckoning. Everyone, regardless of time or station, understands what it means to see a day's light fade and to know it will not return. Her sunset was not just a royal sunset, it was a human one. And so, her story is retold. In classrooms where students read the revolution's history, in museums where her portraits hang beside those of other doomed monarchs, in quiet corners of historical books where her final hours are recorded with precision. Each retelling carries the weight of both the documented fact and the imagined emotion, merging them into something enduring. When visitors stand in her reconstructed cell at the conciergerie, they often pause before the window, a small, high opening through which a single band of light can fall. It does not matter that the light may not align exactly as it did on October 15th, 1793. The mind fills in what the eyes cannot see. In that sliver of illumination, they picture her, the white dress, the short-cropped hair, the stillness, the way her gaze might have followed the sun until it slipped beyond the horizon. History can never give back the moment itself, but it can hold its outline, like the silhouette of a figure behind a curtain, and pass it forward through time. Marie Antoinette's last sunset has become that silhouette, an image as delicate and enduring as the memory of her name. Long after the crowds have gone, long after the scaffold has rotted, long after the world she knew has been remade, that final light remains, flickering in the pages of history, quietly refusing to go out.